if we don't assume that everybody understands our world from our skull and they're seeing it the way we're seeing it, we give them that space, we can have more empathy and compassion and try to help them go, okay, well, this is how I'm experiencing it. Because they might not know. And because they don't know, they're doing something that's really a problem for you, but they don't know why it's a problem for you. So they're not going to change because they don't get it. And assuming they should is not really fair to them. You know what I mean? And that comes back to
Yeah.
the intent thing, right? His intent wasn't to cause me trouble. He didn't know. This is Way of the Artist with Brandon Colby Cook and Evan Schulte.
Identifying your blocks and demystifying your struggles
so that you can claim your own path
and make your life a work of art.
God, I hate conflict. Conflict, man, conflict. It's challenging. All right, Evan, that's the name of this episode. We talked about it and we decided, you know what, let's just have some fun with this. Let's play a bit. And yeah, that's what we came up with, because conflict can be tough. Conflict can be challenging, but it can also be very necessary. So we're gonna get into that. How you doing, Evan?
I'm doing pretty good, Brandon. You know, we're here to have a honest conversation and confrontation with this thing called conflict. And you know, I think that a lot of people are having some challenges these days. I know I've been one of them with, you know, where there's a lot of crazy shit going on, and you know, there's confrontation. I mean, in the best of times, you know, we have to deal with conflict and confrontation, and with people that we care about, and with friends, with family, and coworkers, what have you. And you know, very few people thrive in that situation, you know, and I think that's a good thing. I can't even imagine what our world would be like if everyone was just people who thrived in confrontation all the time. For most of us, we're probably a little bit uncomfortable with conflict, and how do we manage that? How do we navigate that? Because it's inevitable. You know, in all of our lives, there's going to be some degree to which we have to come into conflict, have to confront something or someone, whether that's, you know, with ourselves, you know, because we can definitely be in conflict with ourselves and have to confront things within ourselves, just as with other people. So how do we stand in that? How do we deal with that thing that's so uncomfortable that makes most of us want to run the other way? You know, I think that for myself, you know, I have a tendency to avoid confrontation, but have still no less found myself in situations where I have to step into it, and sometimes knowingly so, being like, you know what, I can see where this is heading. I see that there's a situation that is brewing, that is developing. It's going to boil over at some point if I don't do something now. And it's never a fun thing. You know, it's never something that I look forward to or I look for, but is something that you have to do it. And so let's get into this tricky business and situation of conflict and confrontation, Brandon.
Let's do it. I was definitely conflict avoidant for most of my life. And it's only in recent years that I feel like I've really become better at standing up for myself and consistent with it. And that took a lot of work, and I'm still learning how to do it. And I feel like whenever you're learning how to do something that you maybe didn't get taught how to do as a kid, or, you know, you just never had any guidance with, or you were never encouraged to, or your family dynamic was actually benefited off you not standing up for yourself, like mine, um, there's no real way to learn it, because what you learn is conflict avoidance, because you learn that actually to keep the most amount of peace is often to just avoid the conflict altogether. For
Or
me, I
sometimes
mean,
to feel safe,
yeah, or to feel
because
safe.
I can relate to that too, where it's like something has maybe happened or I'm being treated in a certain way that I don't care for, but my experience had been that, if I said something or stood up for myself, I would potentially subject myself to, further bullying or further being picked on, or, abuse of some kind. So, there can be a very good and legitimate reason for where we learn these habits.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Sorry, continue,
No,
Brandon.
I mean, I was actually going to say a similar thing, because that was partly why I avoided conflict, because actually getting into conflict often made it worse. And something that I learned as I think I started to get into my 20s, I started to learn this, which I think is late in life to actually start to learn this. But I started to realize that conflict didn't have to be a yelling match. It didn't have to be aggressive, and it didn't have to be like really dominating. But when I was younger and I was growing up in my family, it was very much like that. It was very dominating, often turned into yelling matches. The more powerful person kind of won. And that's just kind of how it worked in my dynamic. So you kind of had a pecking order in when I was younger. There's a pecking order. I had two older brothers and my dad, and I was the youngest. And for me, I was the lowest on the totem pole as far as that went. So what I had to say, what I thought was okay, how I felt, was not really ever going to be something that was heard. So one of the methods I learned how to communicate with people was I learned how to cry for what I wanted. And it's really not a good habit to have as a guy, but as a boy growing up, to cry for what you want. But one way that I could get people to kind of pay attention to me and listen was I would cry. And I had to break that habit, obviously, because it's not a good habit to have. It's a manipulative habit, right? I mean, it's one thing to cry because you're actually sad and you're upset, but when you learn it as a tactic, which I think people do, it's a tactic for a person that's in a weaker position, and this happens in relationships and all sorts of stuff too. I mean, it's not just, and I'm not the only one that does this or did this. But I also learned that going towards the weakness or the victim position actually gave me more say and more power. And I think when you're in a very dominating conflict and you don't feel like you can stand up for yourself, people will take the victim position. I think this is actually thinking about it. I think this actually happens in politics and social dynamic situations all the time. People are like claim the victim because they feel overpowered by what's ever out there. And it's more powerful to say I'm the victim. And something that I learned as I got older was that I didn't have to be the victim to be heard. And I also learned that a lot of conflicts could be resolved in a very peaceful way, in a way that was very like just two people kind of talking about, hey, this bothers me. And, I just want to let you know. And that person's like, oh, I didn't realize it. It's like, oh, okay, great. I'm glad I said something. I'm glad you did too. And you're like, wow, this didn't turn into like, well, fuck you. And like,
yeah,
whatever. But I think conflict avoidance often comes from us not seeing any other options of how conflict can play out. So I know for me, I avoided conflict because I used to think conflict only happened really one or two ways. Now I can see that it happens in hundreds of different ways, really. But I can actually often direct it, most times, not always, but most times, towards a way that I'm like, I want conflict to be peaceful. But when I was younger, I didn't have that option, so I just avoided it.
Yeah. And I think that, in many ways, I think that a big part of how we deal with confrontation is really it's about approach. Like really there's only, that may be the only thing that we have a certain sense of control of. when it comes to that situation where you either find yourself in the middle of a confrontation or that, you need to confront something and you're taking a sort of deliberate, conscious action towards it, which there's many reasons why that's a good thing to do. Like you said, because if you push a confrontation off, which I've definitely done in my life and often, from having to, we can have all kinds of excuses for why we avoid a confrontation or why we think that that's the best thing to do. Most often the case, it's not the right action from my experience. I've lost a good friend for that reason, where there were things that were going on that were bothering me and had for a long time and basically avoided having that conversation, having that discussion with that friend. And I told myself all sorts of reasons as to why, I couldn't do that or why it would be a bad idea to do that. But ultimately it ended up leading to that avoidance starts to build up. It creates sort of a pile up in your relationship, and things, these sort of cars continue to pile up in that space in your relationship until eventually there's no more room left and it all comes spilling out, so to speak. And would anything have changed, had I confronted earlier? Perhaps, I'll never know that now, but, it's one of those things where I learned that sometimes you have to just confront the things like that are happening, the things that are bothering you, the things that are not okay with you. And that takes a great degree of honesty, with ourselves, because really when we look at sort of, when we start digging at what is the root of conflict, what is the root of confrontation, and why do we have a confrontation with somebody? And there's usually some emotional component to it. Almost always there can be, I think, definitely ideological and behavioral reasons behind it as well, but usually it's because those things are having an impact on us in some way that is unpleasant, to us or to other people around us. There's something that we care about that is being threatened, I think, just to kind of unpack this whole thing of confrontation. Because otherwise, if we weren't bothered by something, there's no need for a confrontation, right? But obviously we're bothered by something, So anyhow, I think that, I don't know where I was going with this, Brandon. I keep on going down different rabbit holes. There's as I'm talking, suddenly there's just oh, there's this thing and there's this thing and there's this thing. We could go down this route and this route. So, but yeah, really, I think that we have to understand that or honesty. That's what we were talking about. There's an emotional component that's going on, and it requires an honesty of saying oh, hey, this is not okay with me. There's something about the actions and behavior of this person, or obviously there can also be things within ourselves, things with how we are conducting ourselves, or things going on in our lives that were not okay, and that requires its own kind of confrontation. And that requires, I think that requires honesty first and foremost on our part.
Honesty is important. I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I do feel like there's a part of it that is us admitting that what's going on for us is going on for us. And, when you're the one that has a problem or you don't like something and trying to figure out okay, well, I think sometimes we don't learn that we can say, this is not okay. I don't like it. I don't want to be a part of it. And this can happen with family, but it can happen with friends, peer pressure, stuff like that. It's like, no, I don't, I know you say you're fine, but I don't want to get in the car with you. You've had a few drinks. You know what I mean? Like I'm not going to do it. And they're like, oh, come on, like relax. Why you got to be so uptight or whatever, whatever people do, right. To pressure you into doing something you don't want to do, there's conflict in that. And I think, there's a lot of pressure, and young people experience this a lot, to try and be cool, to try and fit in, to get acceptance. And that can create all sorts of conflict because you don't want to do what the group is doing or what people are doing. But maybe you go along with it. That's conflict avoidance, right? The conflict would be standing in your ground. And I think a lot of it comes down to like actually knowing your values, actually knowing what you stand for, what you care about, what matters. And it's difficult when you're young because you have not, well, some people have, because they have, I think, really awesome parents and teachers and mentors, but not everybody gets that. And I think, actually, I might even argue that most people don't have a great sense of self-esteem and self-identity when they're young. And that's why people are so subjectable to peer pressure. And peer pressure is a conflict. Don't even deny it. It's a conflict, and giving into peer pressure is conflict avoidance. When you don't want to, but you give into it, that is,
that's absolutely conflict.
And it happens with adults too. You might be around somebody and they're talking poorly about somebody and you don't like it, but you don't say anything about it. That's peer pressure as well. That's another example of, I just don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to, like whatever. It has nothing to do with me. And all that stuff, trying to remove yourself from something you don't feel good about, you don't feel right about, that's conflict avoidance. It's not always just some big fight. I got to have this talk with this person. I got to do this thing. We have to have it out. Sometimes it's these little subtle things, and they do build on each other. And the one thing that I've learned as I've gotten older, because I did so much conflict avoidance, is that people learn that they can get away with stuff with you. That they just go, I can get away with this with him, but I can't get away with it with her. And so what ends up happening is people are willing to do things around you, but they're not willing to do it around other people. And you actually put yourself into a position of creating a world you don't want around you. So I started going, well, fuck that. I'm going to start standing up for myself. I'm going to start saying what I don't like. And if people don't like it and I ruffle their feathers and they don't want to be my friend anymore, they don't like me, that's fine. Because I don't want to live in a world where people think they can walk on me or they think they can get away with that shit. And it's difficult. That's all I can say. It's really fucking hard to do, but it's so good when you do it. When you finally start getting some momentum and you start feeling some confidence, like I'm way stronger, way more powerful, and I have way more of the world around me that I want now. But it was not easy, and it's still not easy. There's conflicts I come into now that I'm like, oh, it's like, everything levels you up though.
Yeah. I think that this brings up an interesting side to conflict, which is that almost the gift of conflict, which is that it in many ways shows us where we're at in a multitude of ways, but it shows us where our boundaries are. When conflict arises, it shows us where our boundaries are. It shows us what has meaning to us. And it can show us where we have strength, but it can also show us where maybe we're wrong, which is the other flip side to this. Because that's the thing with any conflict, there has to be at least two parties involved. Conflict doesn't happen within a single. It always has multiples. It comes in.
You can have internal conflict, but there's two forces that are always at play.
Yes, there's two forces that are always at play. And so yeah, you can have a conflict within yourself, but it's like that thing you talk about, the peer pressure, right? Where, it's a simple kind of way of looking at it where, oh, my friends all want me to get in the car, but the person driving has been drinking, right? And I know for myself that that's dangerous and that scares me, and I don't like that or encourage that. But at the same time, I want to be accepted by them. I don't want, these people to think that I'm, a loser or, am just being too uptight, blah, 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 blah. Those are two opposing forces that are happening within a single being, but there's still two things at play that are in conflict with each other. Otherwise, there's no conflict. But where that, what I was saying was that essentially, because there is that element, of there being sort of two opposing ideas or what have you, is that your position might be the one that's incorrect, or you might be the one who has something more to learn in a certain way. That's always a possibility. And I think that when we allow ourselves that, I think that when we leave room within ourselves to be wrong, to be incorrect and in whatever the conflict is, we actually put ourselves in a better position to resolve it. We put ourselves in a better position to be able to hear the other side of the story, to be able to reason with greater clarity. I think that, it helps us to approach the situation with I don't know, kind of acting in good faith, which is another element to this that I think is really, really important when it comes to any kind of confrontation or debate or argument or whatever. Because, conflict comes in many different types of forms, right? Some more or less subtle than others. But I think that we need to it serves us to come into any conflict out of good faith to some degree, that we don't make sort of create villains and whatever when we approach it, where we say, it's like, okay, well, maybe I'm missing something, and maybe this person, they're not a bad person and they mean well, and they're not meaning to do whatever it is that they're doing. Now there's an opportunity for us to figure something out. There's an opportunity for both of us to potentially learn something, to grow, for something good to come out of it, which I think is interesting to look at what the gifts of conflict and confrontation are.
It raised up something good. I mean, I think it's, not assuming the worst is a good position to take. I think that I don't know. I personally find that one challenging at times. And I want to say that when I was younger, I was much more on I'm not going to assume the worst, but maybe I wasn't. I don't know. But I think the thing that I find challenging is that, I don't know, man. I personally think that people are pretty selfish and they're pretty self-involved. And I think that's okay. I don't think it's actually a bad thing. I just think that that's kind of what's happening. And I don't think we should necessarily look at that as a bad thing. I think if you make being selfish and self-involved a bad thing, you're going to ensue bad intent. But here's the thing. You're selfish. I'm selfish. Everybody's selfish and self-involved, and that's just the reality. And the problem is that when we walk around and pretend we're not, but others are. And, I've talked on podcasts before and interviews, and I've actually said this, and people get uncomfortable. I've said, I think people are selfish and self-involved for the most part. And some of my favorite philosophers, I've actually heard them say that as well. And I didn't even get that from them. I just got that from life experience, but it just further confirmed my thoughts. And the thing is it's actually very natural, but we make selfishness and self-involved a bad thing. When you're in conflict with someone, yeah, they're looking out for their interests. They're looking out for what matters to them. They're looking sometimes to be right, sometimes to be heard, sometimes just to not be, or not have something taken from them, or to not lose something, whatever. But if you don't look at that as an attack against you, you just look at that as a self-survival kind of model. I think for the most part, you can go, well, okay, like that's how people are. That's okay. Like it's okay for us. It's natural for us as human beings to look out for ourselves, because a lot of us don't have people looking out for us. So we learn, well, I need to look out for me. And those types of people sometimes can be the most difficult, because you're like, well, you're so defensive. You're not like, you're not admitting where you have any fault or whatever. I just have to say that, um, you know, when you have a really supportive friend group, a really supportive family, you have really good teachers that were encouraging, coaches, stuff like that, it's really easy for you to deal with conflict in some ways, because you have like a backing. You have like people around you. And I'm not going to say this as an absolute, but I'd say for the most part, it makes life a lot easier, because you feel like you have a support system and a certain sense of community and connectedness. So in this one particular situation, you're not alone in the battle. But some people are in conflict and they don't have that. They don't have a support system. They didn't have really good teachers. They don't have great coaches. They don't have really good friend group or partner or whatever that supports them, encourages them. And so it's life or death for them in their experience. And that makes the conflict so, it's just like you don't even want to give an inch, because in that situation, it's only you protecting you. And I think that you have to understand that when people are really defensive and very, I want to say, like in their ego and very much like about themselves, try not to look at it as like a personal attack, but as a personal form of protection, you know, and that way you don't take it as an attack against you. I have trouble with this because I do think there are, and I said this on the podcast before, I do think there are some people out there who have, they're in a bad place. They've gotten themselves to a bad place. I think they started breaking their morals at a certain point in their life, and they just went down a road. It was darker and darker and darker. And I think that it's important for us as a society to be able to identify when someone's very toxic, and not to necessarily be like, they're a bad person, but understand they made a series of bad choices that make them toxic. And when they're toxic, you need to be able to identify that and remove yourself sometimes from that situation, because a person in a really toxic situation does not care about anything good. They just want to hurt. Some people are in that place. They just want to hurt. They just want to hurt you. They want to watch the world burn. And they're in that place. And so, Evan, I agree with you. I agree with you. I just want to say, I feel it's so important. My caveat is, yes, but we have to make room for that portion, which is probably very small, but a certain collection of people that are just, you know, they get a little bit of power, they're going to abuse it. That's where they're at, you know?
And I think that I agree. There are situations and cases like that. And I think that sometimes people are sometimes not even aware of that, you know, like toxic people who aren't aware that they're being toxic and destructive, or, you know, they're just kind of looking to pull somebody down into whatever, you know, they're in. That certainly does happen, but I think that reveals itself pretty clearly. You know, I think that, you know, what I'm speaking to is more so as we're going into any sort of confrontation, like consciously, knowingly walking into a situation that's like that we start from a place of good faith. And if...
Do you mean like benefit of the doubt?
I suppose so. Not necessarily the benefit of the doubt, because and maybe we disagree on this, Brandon, but like I live by the belief that people are doing the best that they can. That, you know, within their current, their situation, their beliefs, their capacities, whatever they have, that they are doing the best they can. Because I believe that if they could do better, they would. And to me, that's where kind of part of the root of compassion comes from, is that recognition. It's like, look, you're doing the best you can. It might not be great. It might infuriate me. It might, piss me right off, but that is the best that you have right now, and now maybe we're in a situation where I have to confront something within that where we're saying is like, hey, look, like you might not be aware of this, but this thing that's happening is having an effect and it's not okay with me. Right. And we can do that from a place of kindness and compassion, of seeking understanding, of seeking resolution with somebody. We can come into the field of conflict with a spirit of reconciliation, with some
with the intent to resolve with peace and
yes.
find a harmonious resolution between both of us, where we can at least agree to disagree and kind of find some kind of mutual respect.
Yeah. And you bring in a word, intention, and I don't usually say something really strongly, but this is something that currently right now I do feel very strongly about. There are, I don't know how large how widespread this sort of thought belief goes right now, but there's this idea out there these days that intention doesn't matter anymore. And I think that's just that is such a wrong idea. That is such a horribly wrong idea, because how can we act in good faith with each other? How can we come together when intention doesn't matter? When that's
crazy talk.
It's
totally
nuts.
Matters. I mean, because people are going to do stuff and they're going to do it and it's going to infringe on your zone. It's just going to happen. There's fucking billions of people on the planet. Come on. And sorry to cut you off, Evan, but it's like, people are going to infringe on you. If they can't actually honestly let you know, oh, I didn't realize I did that. That wasn't my intention. And that's not enough for you. That's fucked up. You know what I mean? Like for example, at work, I go into one of the offices for shipping. I just want to tell a story. It relates exactly what you're talking about. And I go in there and I sit with a couple of guys and we joke around and we eat our lunches and whatever and do guy things. And there's a chair, but it's in a weird position. So when I want to eat lunch, I often will move it to the other side of a desk so I can kind of sit over there with everybody and they eat at their desks and whatever. But that's not my office, so I just join them. But I'll run back at the end of lunch to get to my shift and I forget to move the chair. I didn't realize that this was kind of like bothering them. I didn't even realize I was doing it, honestly. I forgot that I even moved the chair in the first place. Anyway, they mentioned it and I was like, oh shit, sorry. And then they played a joke on me and they put the chair outside and they're like, if you want to sit down in here, you're going to have to bring the chair in, so they kind of giving me that. I was like, fine. But the thing is one of the guys said, yeah, like, well, you move the chair and you come in, that's disrespectful. And I said, you know what? You're right. It probably is. I don't mean to be disrespectful. I get it's your space and I'm fucking it up and whatever. And it is just a chair, but it's not my intention. Like I'm just honestly coming in there to connect with you guys. If that's not good enough of an answer, because that's the truth for me, then that's fucked up, because that's like assuming that I came in there to disrespect your space and I just did a disrespectful thing and it's disrespectful, period. And there's no fucking, it's like I learn and then I don't do it anymore because I learned. But like, if you don't say anything, I don't know. And it's like, intention does matter. I agree. Yeah. And I disagree with the thought that some people are saying, if that's what they're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. And cause like even, and with that, it's like you bring in the element of course you correct the behavior,
yes.
like, because we're talking about kind of ignorance in this level. It's just like, oh, I did not realize this. Now I know, now I can change that. But yeah, this idea that intention doesn't matter and you're just a piece of shit, which is basically kind of the where it inevitably kind of leads when we come in with an attitude of intention doesn't matter. It's just, you're basically now just saying, well, you're just a piece of shit then. And that's not necessarily the case. So coming kind of back around to something you were commenting on, you know, we have to come in from that place of good intention. If we're going to have any sort of hope of coming to some kind of a productive, creative resolution towards something, almost always there needs to be some element of good faith that we have towards each other in a conflict. Now, you can't control whether the other party comes to the table with that, but you can come to the table with that. And for me, that is where you can have some place of strength to come in from. There's integrity when you come in with that. And someone can either meet you in that place, or you will know probably in fairly short order whether that person is not going to meet you in that place, in which case, yeah, it's like kind of what you were saying. Some people are just, you know, they're in a space where they just want to be destructive. In which case, I kind of want to say it's like, well, then your hands are kind of clean, you know, your hands are kind of clean of the situation, but you know, it still requires some kind of a conscious, aware approach on your own part, because you can come to the table with that, and it's not a guarantee of anything, but at least then you can walk away saying, you know what, I did my best. You know, I did my best in that situation, and it didn't have the outcome that I wanted it to have, but I did my best. And then we have the recognition and compassion towards ourselves in that situation. You know, yeah.
I like that. I mean, if you come at it with integrity and you come at it with honesty, and you have the courage to say what you need to say and stand for what you need to stand, and that person is just not going to even respect that, appreciate that, respond to that. There's just like, it might be like, you might ask them for something and they might say, I hear that, but look, I'm not going to do that because this is why it infringes on me. And I get what you're asking me to do. Because sometimes people, and I think we have to admit this with ourselves, this is where the honesty comes in. Sometimes what we're asking for when we're in conflict is too much, and it's unfair for us to ask for it, but we don't know that. Mm-hmm. And this could be all sorts of situations where it's like, well, it would make my life easier if you did this, but you don't realize what that actually takes for that other person to do. And that other person is like, I'm not doing that. Like, I get that it makes your life easier. I totally understand that, but I'm not going to do that. Like, cause that makes my life way more difficult. So, you know, compromise starts to come into this. You know, it's like, you know, you can be in conflict with someone and sometimes what you're asking for is not fair. And, you know, for example, the job that I do right now, I drive some big machines that could maim you or kill you, because they're fucking fast and powerful. And if you get hit by them, it's like getting hit by a car, you know? So, or maybe a Mack truck. I mean, these things, we're moving around and they move in weird ways. You know, they don't, the forklift is generally like similar to a vehicle, but then I drive a side loader. If people aren't familiar with that, it drives sideways and it turns in an interesting way. And also it's not like you're looking out a window, you're looking through a mast of metal and you can't see through it. So we got this new guy there, and I'm just explaining this because I feel like it furthers the point. He kept standing in front of the table when I'm driving the side loader in to load up the material. And it's such a dangerous place to be. And I was starting to get a little like, you know, angry about it, upset about it. And I'm like, fucking guy is like clueless. And I'm like, hold on. So what I did was I took him aside and I said, here, stand in this machine. And then I stood where he would stand. And I go, pretty difficult to see me, right? No, it's, oh yeah. I go, just be careful where you're standing because when I'm coming in, it's difficult, and this thing is, and he got it. And we came to
Yeah.
some kind of resolution. And it's like, um, sometimes you got to try to help people have an experience of what you're going through so they even know. He didn't know standing in the table was causing me any problems.
Yeah.
And me telling him to move is one thing, but me actually taking the time to show him and give him the experience of what I'm experiencing, that resolved the conflict in such a peaceful, cool way. The alternative option would have been get out of the fucking way, stop standing in front of the machine. I mean, that's one way to settle it, but that's a very high conflict way to settle it. I kind of want to further your point, which I'm saying that if we don't assume that everybody understands our world from our skull and they're seeing it the way we're seeing it, we give them that space, we can have more empathy and compassion and try to help them go, okay, well, this is how I'm experiencing it. Because they might not know. And because they don't know, they're doing something that's really a problem for you, but they don't know why it's a problem for you. So they're not going to change because they don't get it. And assuming they should is not really fair to them. You know what I mean? And that comes back to the intent thing, right? His intent wasn't to cause me trouble. He didn't know. He's new. He doesn't know what it's like to drive the machine. It's easier for him to stand wherever he's standing.
Yeah.
They're not personal.
Should thing is a dangerous thing,
Right.
like we say, don't should on yourself. It's like, well, they should know. And it's just like, well, they don't.
Yeah, well, they don't. Yeah.
like what's the point in being upset about it? When you have an opportunity to, turn it into going back to our last podcast, into a moment of connection. And that's something that I'm realizing with this conversation is like, hey, let's just have the recognition that, hey, we're humans, this is, you're a human, I'm a human, we both face human things, and probably neither of us want to be in a situation of a conflict or confrontation right now, so let's treat each other like human beings. And I think that, it can be very easy in our world today to let that slide, to let that slip. But I would argue that there's nothing that is more important today than to treat each other like human beings. To always keep that, in our hearts and minds when we're entering into a conflict. Just like, this is a human being, and I might disagree with them, and I might deplore some of the things that they're doing and some of the behavior that they're showing and the way that they're making me feel or what have you. But this is a human being. And again, from that, like what you're saying, like acting from that place of good faith, another way of recognizing good faith is to say, like, maybe they just don't know. Maybe they just don't honestly understand that how this is affecting me, that this is, causing me a lot of discomfort, what have you. Because I think that more often than not, that's usually the case, because people love to help when people are asked for help. It's like, and it's so rare. Like, I can't remember the last time somebody just asked me for help, but I know that anytime someone has ever said, like, hey, can you help me with something? There's just some part of me, and I don't think I'm a unique person in this, in any way whatsoever. But most people are really willing to help, and I'm pretty sure that there's been some good studies that have been done on this, that people are willing to help when they're asked. People want to be helpful. People want to be useful. But we're so afraid to ask for that, and I think that, I don't know, I think that that's just an interesting thing that comes back around to what you were saying, in that, that's another way in which we can establish that good faith. It's just like, hey, maybe they don't know. In addition to the fact of maybe there's something that I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then we actually approach a conflict out of a sense of open curiosity, as opposed to, I've got to dig my heels in and they're going to dig their heels in, and it's going to be, and it's going to be a clash.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's just like, no, I'm actually just curious about what's happening here. You know, this is causing me some sort of emotional distress, so we need to acknowledge that. But I think that it makes it a much more approachable situation when we come in with that sort of, that gives us a window into something that opens it up a little bit more.
I like that, to go into things, going particularly to conflict with curiosity. Curiosity is such a great option. You know, it's like a great default for just about anything. I mean, get curious and you solve a lot of your problems. When you think you know and you think you're right and you think you have all the answers, that's where a lot of conflict comes from. I mean, it's just it's a recipe for it. So I love that. I think you contributed a really good element to this conversation that way. And I think with curiosity, it's like, you know, understanding. Here's the thing. Something I learned through studying a lot of philosophy was that there are people who, let's just make this very simple. And I don't mean to say this in a simple way, because I think our audience is smart enough to get it, but it's just, I'm going to say it in the most simple way. Imagine there's kind of wise people and ignorant people, right? If wise people assume ignorant people are wise, there's a huge amount of conflict just out of that situation. If wise people expect ignorant people to act as wise people do, there's also a huge amount of conflict that's created. Now, if a wise person is ignorant but thinks they're wise, huge amount of conflict. If an ignorant person thinks they're wise, huge amount of conflict. So you see, like, it's very simple. There's people who are in a position of ignorance and people who are in a position of wisdom. And sometimes both are each in a position of wisdom and a position of ignorance. I'm wise about what I know, you're wise about what you know, but I'm ignorant about what you know and you're ignorant about what I know. Now, if we came at things knowing that dynamic, it solves so many conflicts, because you go, oh, I see, you're ignorant to what I'm going through and I'm ignorant to what you're going through. Let's resolve that. Boom, conflict resolved. Simple, right?
And that's wise.
Yeah, that's wise, right? I mean, it's funny when you break things down to their most basic elements, because sometimes it takes a very what seemingly complex thing and it goes, oh, I was in an argument with my girlfriend or my boyfriend or whoever, or my wife or husband or best friend or whoever, because I was wise to what I was wise. They were wise to what they were wise, but we were both ignorant of each other's wisdoms. And instead of talking about that and working that out and sharing that, we both assumed we were right and that they should be wise to what we're wise about without ever doing that. And that's the problem. Boom. You know how many things could be resolved by that simple equation? Like, it's incredibly simple, but it works. Yeah. I think the hard thing though sometimes is, when you're a wise person, okay, I'm not saying like you're wise and someone's ignorant. Sometimes ignorant people are ignorant and they don't want to become wise, and you can't make them want to become wise to it, and they won't become wise to it, and they don't care, and they're just not open to it. And you have to like make room for that. It's just, unfortunately and fortunately, part of the process of the human dynamic. You just can't make people do things. You have to they have to have a reason to care, and so sometimes people, they don't know you, they don't have time for you in their world, and they don't care. And you can be like, well, by the way, this really hurt my feelings. And they don't give a shit, because to them, it doesn't matter. And they're self-involved and selfish like you are in your own way, because you want them to care. But it's like, we can add some complexities to this simple equation of the wisdom and ignorance, but then the caring and not caring element, which makes it a little more complicated. But just keep it at the wisdom and ignorance thing, and it'll resolve like 90%. The last 10%, it starts to get complex. But that's where you go and you ask, a therapist or a teacher or a mentor, maybe go to a podcast, or you go to something to find out that answer. But for 95% of problems, they're very, very simple.
Yeah. Part of that sort of equation that you were drawing out, I thought was kind of funny, in that a wise person expecting an ignorant person to be wise.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, that's not very wise of the wise person.
No, it isn't.
But I like that because I was just like, because there's always something to learn.
Yeah.
It's like if you recognize, if you're getting upset by, an ignorant person acting foolishly, well, then that shows you that you have something to learn yet as well.
I'm glad you brought that. What a great insight. I mean, that's the funny thing, that the hubris and the ego that comes with wisdom, or woke. I'm woke. I'm wise.
I don't want to equate wokeness and wiseness as the same thing, because I don't think that they're the same thing.
It's like, I mean, you know where the word cool came from? Apparently it came from the idea that people who are in the know, they know what's going on. They're up and up with it. They're like, they get the higher level stuff that's happening. And when you're not cool, you don't get it. You're not aware. You're kind of like caught in it all. And woke has elements of that, but whatever. My point is that there's this positioning and posturing that people do when they're like, well, I'm wise, I'm cool, I'm better than you. And that's a big part of conflict too. It's like when you think you're better than someone else, when you think you're superior and you act that way and you treat them as less than you, that's dumb. And that is unwise. That is super ignorant. So, and it's what's funny about that is the person who's acting superior is actually the person that's ignorant. And they're blaming the other person for their own ignorance. So I think that's where, you brought into this very early to the conversation, it's honesty. Be honest about where you're ignorant. Be honest about where you're not cool, be honest about where you're not on the up and up. And, and understand that you weren't always, and you had to learn, and maybe these other people or other person, they didn't have the chance, yet. Enlighten them, help them, be a teammate.
Or maybe they'll enlighten you on something that you had never considered before. I always love that experience when suddenly there's a perspective. There's a perspective that I get from somewhere that just changes the landscape a little bit for me. I was like, oh, I've never looked at it that way. And now like that's shifted my understanding of this issue. That's shifted, that's a beautiful thing. And when you can do that with another person, when you and another person can come together, on seemingly separate ground, and you can come together in that spirit of good faith, of resolution, of, hey, let's see if we can walk away with a better understanding of each other and this thing that we're in conflict about. Let's see if together we can walk away and understand this problem better. Mm-hmm. And we can both learn and grow from it. That's the thing I think is, I've heard it said that we're not actually afraid of the unknown. We're afraid of losing what we have. And I think that, when it comes into conflict, especially since often conflict comes with people who are close to us in some way, or who are just, they're in our lives in some significant way, right? Because people who aren't important in our lives, it's, who cares? Like we turn them off, right? Like it doesn't matter.
Well, that's,
Yeah, but it's normally with people that we're closer with that we come into conflict. Well,
the conflict becomes more difficult, I would say. I wouldn't say that we come into conflict, but I would say it becomes more difficult the more personal and intimate it is.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And in many ways, it's because I think that there's something we're afraid of losing. We're
like that person in our relationship with them.
Yeah. Like that might go, or, who the hell else knows? Our minds can play all kinds of crazy tricks and about, potential futures for us. Right. But I mean, when we look at it instead of like, oh, I'm going to lose something, looking at it as an opportunity to gain something, looking at it as like, we have a real opportunity here to understand each other on a deeper level and maybe come away, better people than we were before, not further apart, but closer. Like, cause that's a real possibility within conflict, within confrontation, because you're both, in that situation, you're connected to something very deep and meaningful to you, whether that's for a good reason or not, right? But together you might find out.
Mm-hmm.
Together you might show each other something and be like, oh wow, I'm actually a better person now because of this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, coming in with that open curiosity about it, like, maybe I'm wrong, maybe they're wrong, I don't know, let's find out. That can serve us really, really well in coming to some kind of a peaceful resolution.
Mm-hmm. Man, so much good stuff. I want to. Oh man, there's so many things that I want to say, but one is that I do think that conflict, if you look at it as something that actually can bring you closer, you won't run from it so much. I've had some situations, and I feel like I'm getting better at it. I feel like there's certain conflicts that are more challenging and they're a little bit more difficult, and the dynamic of them is not it's not always in my wheelhouse to know how to deal with, right? But I remember there's a time with a friend back in the day. I started dating a girl who apparently he really liked. I didn't know this, but apparently he really liked, and apparently a lot of our mutual friends knew this, but I didn't. And this girl and I, whatever, had a chemistry, started dating. It was relatively new, and he was really upset because he felt like I started dating the girl that he really liked, blah blah blah, whatever. And but it wasn't whatever to him. And there was a part of me that was like, oh man, I don't want to have this conversation. This is really going to be uncomfortable. And I was like, you know what? Let's just call him up. Let's just talk to him and say, like, and he was like, well, I can't believe you started like this. I can't believe you started dating her. Like, that I like, he assumed that I knew. And I was like, you knew that I liked her and you did it anyway and blah, 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 blah. And that's why I was so upset. I said, dude, I didn't even know she was on your radar. Like, I didn't know. I mean, yeah, she's a good looking girl, but I didn't know you had feelings. And I was like, after this talk, it might be he and I are not friends, or I'm not dating this girl anymore. I was walking into this knowing that it might go this way. And as we got into it, he started to understand that it was innocent, that I started dating her because her and I just had chemistry. And, I think I just really tried to understand where he was coming from. And what it turned into was neither he and I split as friends, and I didn't stop dating the girl. But what he ended up saying was, I just miss you, man. I feel like we never hang out anymore. And I was like, dude, I feel that too. And I'm like, but all this was all kind of bottled up, and the issue was not the issue. That's the thing about conflict that's sometimes interesting. I went into this conflict thinking that we were going to be talking about a girl and our relationship in relation to that. And it turned out that really, we aren't in each other's lives enough, and we don't know what's going on for each other. And if I was in his life more, I would have known what was going on for him. And he realized that because I'm not in his life anymore, it was innocent, or I wasn't in his life as much as he wanted it. He realized, well, I never really shared that with you. And so we just kind of went, well, I said at the end, I'm like, look, if you want me to end this thing, if that's what you feel, we have the friendship. If that's what you think is best, I could. And he said, no, he's like, no. He's like, no, he's like, you guys obviously have a chemistry. It's obvious. It's not there with us. It's obviously there with you. So he's like, I don't want to get in the way of that. And it worked out to be really good that way, Mm-hmm. And the thing is that was a difficult talk. It's a difficult talk for a couple of young guys to have too. And conflict can be profound that way, but you also have to go into it knowing that it can also go not the way you want it to go. But it's very important to enter the arena of it and just try to be honest, try to be, real. And if I did something that was wrong, if I did something that was really infringing, then admit that, I knew you liked her, but I didn't think, whatever. But that wasn't the case. It was actually a lot more innocent. And I think you need to be honest with your friends and these people in your life and admit when you do something that's maybe shady or maybe careless, that you just own up to it, Maybe they won't, but I think that it's always the more powerful person that is willing to own when they are doing something that they're like, look, I just wanted to do what I wanted to do. You know what I mean? And just
Yeah.
people can at least respect that, you know?
Mm-hmm.
What people I find in conflict don't like, including myself, is we don't like it when people lie to us. Because when someone tells us the truth, like we can be like, well, I don't like the truth, but you told it to me and I can respect that. I think most people's position is usually that they might not like it, but they can respect it. And I find that respect is a lot more important than being liked, in most scenarios.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say that it's like, I've been married for coming on to 4 years now, almost together with my wife for 9 years altogether, and living together for most of those. And, and there are challenging conversations, that happen in a relationship like that, as I'm sure anyone who's in a similar situation can attest to. There's challenging conversations and things that need to be confronted. And it's kind of that, it's almost like a token thing, but there's a lot of truth to it, like in a lot of those, sort of like couples therapy and stuff, like they talk about how it's like, well, talk about how you feel. Don't start going with like, well, you're doing this and you're doing that and blah, blah, like, cause that gets really dicey really quickly and it doesn't go anywhere really at all. And it's also a really great way to get gaslit too.
Yeah, totally.
In a situation. But when you make it about, and I'm fortunate that, I have a partner who's very mindful and kind of just geared this way, where it's just like, I feel this and I'm feeling that. And it's one of those things that's a beautiful place to come together, because you can't argue with how somebody feels. There's not really an argument to be had. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't necessarily trigger my own stuff sometimes, but it suddenly confronts me with, very often I find that it confronts me with feelings and things that I haven't been expressing. Right. And then it's just like, okay, well, I feel, and when you just have that level of honesty about how you're feeling, and the courage to share that, it leads, it's always, in speaking just of, the relationship with my wife, it's like those conversations, as uncomfortable as they've been, it's always brought us closer, but because we speak to each other in a way of like, I feel this way, and yeah, it's a kind of like a great little hack in a way, but like it's very easy to overlook, because our minds almost always want to project outwards. We want to put how we feel out on someone else, and we want to blame somebody for that, right? And as opposed to just expressing how we're feeling and why we think we're feeling that way, it's actually much simpler to do it that way, and also feels a lot better to do it that way.
I mean, I want to say that I think that with your relationship, and I don't know it like you do, but I feel like with your relationship with your wife, you guys have done a lot of work on yourselves, and you have gotten past a lot of ego stuff, and it allows you to have those conversations. I think that a lot of people, they haven't done that work yet. They haven't gotten emotionally in touch. They don't even know how they feel. They don't even know what feeling they're feeling when they're feeling it. It's like, and they don't have the words to articulate and describe it. So this can be very difficult. And I think also the masculine side of our world, and I'm not just saying men, I'm saying masculine, the masculine energy of our world, which is both men and women, and the ego part of it. People are afraid to be vulnerable and even say that they're afraid to be vulnerable. And it's, I think sometimes you got to take a risk And sometimes people will, you'll tell them how you feel and they might take advantage of that. They might abuse it. But part of the courage to do the right thing, to do the thing that creates progress, that creates, the friend that I had at the time where he said, I just miss you. That was a powerful moment for us. That was vulnerable. He broke out of his ego for a moment, right? And it brought us closer. I think those types of things are, they're very powerful, but they're not always easy to do. And, I think that it also, and I want to just mention this, also, they're not easy. Also, they're not always safe to do with certain people. And I feel like safety is something that a lot of us, we don't really realize how much we're looking for that in our lives. But a good friend and a good partner makes you have a sense of safety. And like, if I'm vulnerable or I'm weak or if something happens, you're not going to take advantage of that. You're not going to power play me on that. Some people will, though. Some people will power play you on that. And, I think that this is one of the complicated elements of conflict. But I do agree. I think you're right. I think that's where a lot of courage and power starts. I just don't think that that's always a solution. I think that people hear that and they go, oh, great, I'll just tell people how I feel. And it's like, it will work in some cases. Some cases it might not. And so don't just write it off because in some cases it doesn't. I think what's great, what you've built, but I also want to just kind of put out the caveat that like, it does work when you're with somebody that's open to receive that, but it might not work when you're with somebody who isn't. And so it's not a across the board solution, but I think it's the better way to go. Don't get me wrong. I just think sometimes it takes time to build to a place where you can actually share vulnerabilities with each other that way.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think you raise a very good point. You raise a very good point because, the level of vulnerability that I have and need to go into with my wife is different than the level of vulnerability that I would need to go into with a coworker, right?
Totally.
But I think vulnerability is always a key ingredient, but it's what level of vulnerability is required, right? Because it's like, like with my wife, there's like that with any life partner like that, I think that a huge part of it is becoming more and more vulnerable. You push the threshold of your vulnerability with each other, because it's a safe place to do that. It's not a safe place to do that with, your drinking buddies on the weekend necessarily.
Yeah, totally. Can you imagine if you opened up to your drinking buddies on the weekend like you would to your wife or, her husband or someone like that? It's like, that'd be crazy. That would be way too much, It's like too much information.
Yeah. So it's always a level of, you look at what's the relationship, what's the environment, what's the, and what's the vulnerability that's appropriate for that situation. There's almost always some level, but some of it you don't have to tell your coworker absolutely everything about your life story and your deepest darkest fears and secrets. Not required, but you do need to have that vulnerability of being like, hey, like, I'm feeling like, I'm feeling like you're irritated with me, and it's just, it's making me feel, like you don't want me around, and, it's really been bothering me,
yeah, that's a good approach,
whatever. Right. But you've opened yourself up to a level that's appropriate for that situation, right? That you're dealing with, not opening up Pandora's box.
Yes. Really good. And nice practical advice too.
Well, always like to try and keep it practical, Brandon.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like this stuff, with this talk we're having and many talks we have, it is helpful for people to have something practical because these can get a little bit, we go down rabbit holes and we talk about all these complexities, but then you can walk away with and go, what do I do? And, a couple things that, I know we're not necessarily wrapping up just yet, but a couple things I would say, like a couple practical things to walk away with are, to break down the example you said, I feel like you feel this way about me. And it's making me feel like this. Do you feel this way? Am I wrong? And that person can go, no, I have been a little irritated with you. And I go, well, I don't want that. So what's going on? Can we talk? And that's a very vulnerable but powerful way to open up that conversation. So, and I think you gave some other really good practical advice. I just want to point out, which is that opening up to the degree that you do to your best friend or your wife would be different than from your coworker or somebody who's just an acquaintance. I remember, this is hilarious. Oh man. So I'm 2 weeks into this Joe job. This is the last, I haven't worked a Joe job in like 15 years. I've been an artist and an entrepreneur. And a couple of years ago, almost, I got a Joe job, and it turned out to be a nice thing during COVID. But long story short, week 2, working for this company, and you get a mixed bag. You get a new group of guys every week. Week 2 or 3, this guy, he comes in. He's such a weird dude. And we go on our first break, and he comes out to talk to me. And the first thing he starts telling me about his dead parents. And I'm just like, what do I do with this? Like, I don't even know you. like I get that that's something that's probably pretty big for your life, but like, I'm a stranger. And what I'm not afraid to talk about that with someone, but to me, at that point, I'm like, this is not normal. This is very weird. I'm just kind of like, is there something wrong with you? You know what I mean? Like, that's the thing. Like, with vulnerability, if you get too vulnerable with someone too quickly, they might actually be like repelled by that, and because it's not natural. And we have to earn our vulnerability with each other and our trust and all of this stuff and respect. Don't just expect it. So, I mean, it was funny to me in the sense that I was like, this guy just told me about his dead parents and I just met him. I'm like, that's too much too soon. Like, how about we start with like, what's your name and blah, 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 like, that's just too much too soon. So anyway, yeah. I just want to say, like, in relation to what we've been talking about, I found it hilarious at the time. Saying it out loud, I'm like, oh man. I mean, I feel bad for the guy. I mean, but look, we all lose people. I mean, at the end of the day, like, I'm not talking about that to a stranger I meet on the street. That's not a good icebreaker. unless you have some angle on it, maybe. But like,
it better be a good angle.
It better be a good angle. It better be a comedian or something. Cause like, fuck. Dude, there's a few other things I wanted to say about this topic. Before we get into beer, I'd like to just mention this one thing, because I feel like I don't want to walk away from this conversation. And I feel like it plays into this, is that I personally think that power is a very big thing in our culture and just our world. Like, people have positions of power. So like, you have maybe a position at work where you're senior to someone. It might be, you're really, really attractive and you could get a lot of partners. There's certain power in that. You have a lot of money. People have power. And I think that people are often playing for power. And I think that this can play into conflict in a lot of ways. And I think that we all have to be mindful of when we have power and if we're actually looking for it, because I think a lot of conflict goes unresolved because people are power playing each other. They're being like, well, I don't have to do what you want, so I'm not gonna, because you need me, that type of shit. And that's kind of ego. But I think that, when you have power, just remember that there might be a day where you don't. And the way you're treating people when you have power, like the way you treat your waiters, that type of stuff, you have power in that situation, right? The way you treat those people, you might be on the other side of that one day. And conflict is really, a lot of it gets resolved by the person who's in power, not by the person who is in the vulnerable place. So the powerful person, it's really on them to be vulnerable, not as much as it is for, the vulnerable person, because the vulnerable person sometimes, here's the thing. There's power in vulnerability, but I think that we need to all understand that we have power, and sometimes we have way more power than the other person, and we shouldn't abuse that. And I just think that's such an important part of this, because power is very easy to abuse. It's very easy to take advantage of. And it's nice to be the person that doesn't have to care. It's nice to be the person that can just do what they want. And that person will just be like, well, okay, I guess I can't do anything about it. But, that's where your humanity needs to come in. That's where you need to be like, I'm going to be a good person and not an asshole here. Because it's when you have the power, it's easy to be an asshole. And sometimes you might not even think you're being an asshole because you're just being self-protective. But I just think it's a really important thing to mention, because I think that power is a very important element in all of this.
Yeah, no, I agree. And if you're in a position of power, and you have, like, if you are in a situation where you have people who kind of work underneath you, an important trait of a great leader is creating a space for people to be vulnerable. There's like someone like Simon Sinek talks beautifully about about a work environment where the people where employees feel safe to be vulnerable. That's crucial. That's huge. So yeah, no, I think that's a good thing you brought into this.
People flourish when you give them that, right? Like, and I think that's what you want. Like, you might be in a relationship where you're more power in that relationship than your partner. And, you can either push a wedge between yourselves by positioning yourself as powerful and making them less than you, and you will literally drive that apart. Or you can create space be safe for them to be vulnerable, and also for you. And the leader, in my opinion, which is often the person in power, is the one that usually sets the example.
Yeah.
So, if you're more powerful in the situation, and this is hard because sometimes we don't know we are, but if you're more powerful in a situation, your act of vulnerability sets an example that it's okay for others to be vulnerable, and it can create a really, really great thing. So, that's a whole bag of worms,
I'll just say one more thing to that. And again, I'll just borrow, because I had just watched something from Simon Sinek recently, and I don't know if he had said, he probably said this at some point, but this is kind of how I took it in. But if you are like a person in a position of power, and again, we're speaking kind of very about specific environments and situations, but one of the best ways that, if you are in a leadership position, one of the best ways that you show vulnerability is by showing your employees, by showing the people that work for you that they're valued and that you care about them. That's how you show vulnerability as a leader. Because so many leaders are afraid, like most those toxic sort of environments, you have quote unquote leaders who treat everybody like they're expendable and replaceable.
I've experienced that. It's horrible.
It's like, what the fuck are you do you expect that you think you're gonna get the best out of your employees? No, of course not. You're not going to do that. They're not going to bleed for you, because if you don't care for them, why should they care about you? They'll only care enough so that you don't give them shit, or so that you don't fire them. Mm-hmm. That's the best you're going to get from people that way. You get the best out of people by being vulnerable with them, and that's by letting them know that they're valued and that you care about them. That you care about them as and what they contribute. That it matters. That they fucking matter. That's how you can be a vulnerable leader. And in turn, you create an environment for those people to be vulnerable, and you need to be okay with that. Anyhow, this is all about creating better work environments and safe spaces for people to be in the world. That's all very important stuff. That's worth almost another topic.
To bottle cap that though, like, I love what you said. And I just want to say, like, when you're in conflict, letting that person know that they matter is a great way to help the conflict to not spiral out of control. Like, I care about how you feel and what you're thinking about and what's going on for you. And you matter to me. Reminding people of that and telling them that, like, it really will help people to open up. And because I think a large part of conflict problems come from the fact that people, like, you don't care about me, I don't matter to you, you're not hearing me, that type of stuff. Yeah. And you go, and it's kind of like, I hear you, you matter, I care. Like that, if that's part of what you're trying to do, along with curiosity, I mean, boom, you got a great recipe for success.
Yeah. And also, I was saying, in terms of in conflict as well, just more practical stuff that I've learned is make your concessions, you know, and more so in the realm of a debate, sort of a situation. Talk to the person that you're debating with and acknowledge the places where you agree. So if they've said something like a bunch of things towards you, acknowledge where you agree. That's a great place to start building. Acknowledge where you agree with them first and say, you know what, I think you're right about this. I think you're just like, you know what, and I think you're right. I could be better on this point and whatever. I still disagree about this and this, right? But you create a floor of like, okay, like we've got now we have a dialogue happening, where you're not on completely opposite corners of the ring now. It's just like, oh, okay, we're actually, we're not so far away from each other. There are things that we're connected on and with. So,
yeah, actually, it kind of brings up another thing I just want to say. Like, if we think about way of the artist, like, you're on your path, right? And conflict can sometimes be like, well, you're in the way of my path, and that's the conflict. As opposed to looking at it that way, we could look at it like, well, look, we're both on our paths, and you want to go this way and I want to go that way, and let's both help each other on our paths, as opposed to being like, well, your way's wrong or your way's wrong. It's like, look, your way is fine, my way is fine, but like right now it's not helping me go my way and it's not helping you go your way, and let's try and find some ground so that we can walk, you know. Yeah.
But also in that, there's the acknowledgement of, it's like, but our paths have crossed here.
Yes.
Like, and isn't that interesting that our paths have crossed here? I wonder why that is.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about some beer and let's wrap this guy up.
Let's do it.
Because it seems like we could probably just keep on going and going and going, but I think that we've said a lot. All right, I'm not actually drinking a local one. I just saw this one. And I was just like, you know what? I have not had a Belgian beer in a long time, like an honest to goodness Belgian beer from Belgium, and it's a triple.
Oh, I love those triples.
A Belgian triple, triple Carmelite, 3-grain beer. I can still speak English, I think. That's the thing with these triples, man. They're strong. Still brewed after a 17th century recipe from the old Carmelite monastery.
17th century, wow.
Of Dendermonde. The Belgians, man, like they are, I feel like the rest of the world, as much as like the craft brewing scene has been exploding and, definitely in the Pacific Northwest, where we are. It's definitely, but like Belgium has been like, they're still so far ahead of everybody. Like I remember when I was there and I went into like a beer, like just a beer place, and there, like the menu for beer was massive. Like it was like a Bible of beer, and they had something like 400, like close to 500 different beers there. All from Belgium.
Wow.
They were all Belgian. It's like, where do you even begin? Where do you even begin? And they just do it at such a high level. So, you know what? Little tip of the hat to one of the best beer making countries, arguably the best beer making country in the world. So it's been good. It's been enjoyable.
Awesome. Well, today I'm having a beer called Rickard's Red.
Good old Rickard's.
Yeah, Rickard's Red. It's a pretty good little beer. I've had it many times before, and I enjoy it. But I know we've been going for a while on this podcast, but I wanted to share a funny story because I have a friend, or we had a friend, more of acquaintance now, but he, everyone I know has always liked Rickard's Red, including this friend. He likes it. He likes the way it tastes, thinks it's a good beer. But for some reason, there's something they do with Rickard's Red that his body will not accept. And we went to the airport. We were at the airport waiting for a flight or something. We had some Rickard's Red, had a pitcher, and we drank a couple glasses. And all of a sudden he's like, "Oh, I'm sick," and he throws up. And we're like, "Okay, all right."
Is that how he did it? Did he just exclaim, "I'm sick," and then he
started to feel sick, and then he like couldn't control it, and then he like threw up. I think he threw up like in the airport, like so it was not good. And he's not known for that. Okay, so that was weird. And then I went out to this like club, right? We were young, right? We were like in our early 20s, and went out to this club, and we get in there, and they give us a table, and we're relatively early, but we're at a table, and they're like, "You guys want some beer?" We get a pitcher of Rickard's Red, and we're all sitting there, we're all drinking the Rickard's Red. Probably got a couple pitchers of it. We're all enjoying it. All of a sudden, my friend, super sick, he throws up from the table onto the path that everyone had to walk through in the club. Like, so everybody who ever entered that club had to walk through a pile of his Rickard's Red. Anyway, I always find that so funny because it's like the worst. Like, you're just starting the night, and then after that, he was like, "Okay, something's wrong. I can't drink Rickard's Red." But I've never had a problem. I love it. I think it's a super tasty beer. If you don't remember Rickard's Red after this, then I don't know what will help you. But I felt like I had to share that story to honor him and that weird experience or experiences we had. So there you go.
Excellent. All right. Well, wrapping this one up, there's some cool things here, some cool discoveries for me about this thing about being in conflict and having to deal with confrontation. And, I think that just kind of recapping some of the stuff, just to remind myself is, let's assume good faith, until we're proven otherwise, but let's assume good faith. Let's be honest. Let's see it as an opportunity for growth. Let's not see it as a disaster waiting to happen, but an opportunity waiting to be grabbed. You know what? I'm going to leave it there. Let's try and shift our perspective of it as an opportunity waiting to be grabbed. Yeah.
Most everything that I feel like needed to be said has been said. I mean, there's definitely more depth we could go into with all of this. And I think we both know that. But I mean, I think we got to the meat of this, and I'm happy about that. And I think that the thing I just say walk away with is, like, instead of looking at conflict as something that's going to put you into a fight or drive you away from someone, or look at it as something as an opportunity to bring you closer. Opportunity for you to enter their world and see how they see it, and an opportunity for them to enter yours. And if you look at it as a potential thing, as a possibility thing, conflict doesn't become so scary. And instead of this being like, "God, I hate conflict," it could be, "God, I love conflict. What a great chance for us to come together and battle some ideas and really find out where we both really stand.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you got something out of this, if you feel it improved your life or your journey in any way, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a review, or share the episode.
You can also support us on Patreon, where we have tons of great bonuses. You are the ones that make the show possible and help us to thrive. Thank you for joining us.